curator here at the National Museum of Industrial History. And thank you for joining us here today. We've got a number of exciting events coming up that I'd like to tell you about. Our new exhibit about Robert Fulton and the steamboat will be opening next weekend. So if you're around and you'd like to see that, that should be a delight. Please come back, and that'll be on display through August 13th. And then on December 3rd, we will be hosting our annual Winter Welcome. Lots of events, activities for the kids, and Santa will be here. And don't miss our Corliss steam engine coming alive on December 10th. We will be running the Corliss steam engine in the museum, so that is always something to behold. So today we have a very important program for you in conjunction with ArtsQuest InVision Photo Festival. One of the last of the legendary Bethlehem Steel photographers, it's our honor to hear from Peter Treiber today. Peter was born in Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in a family of painters and photographers. He worked in New York City as a photo assistant and earned a degree in graphic design from SUNY Farmingdale. His BFA is in photography from the Art Center College of Design in California. Peter's industrial work included photography for GM, Singer, New York Port Authority, Time, and Fortune. These projects led to positions at International Nickel in New York City and then Bethlehem Steel in Bethlehem. Peter was employed on staff, and then he was later contracted to work with Bethlehem Steel to cover operations at facilities and projects around the country and the world. In 1999, with the new advent of digital photography, Peter turned his focus to shooting and exhibiting fine art photography. His work has been published in numerous magazines. His photographs are in private collections, corporate and institutional collections around the country. He is and the world, and he is a member and past officer of the American Society of Media Photographers. In 2008, with co-author and writer Betty Kovac, Peter and Betty published Inside Bethlehem Steel, and we do have copies of that here for you today. Peter and Betty is also here with us today, and they will be able to sign those copies for you after the talk. And I should mention that Betty worked for almost 3 decades at Bethlehem Steel Corporation in public relations, retiring as the director of corporate communications. She went on to work for other steel companies, as well as American Metal Market, the voice of the North American metals industry, as a marketing manager and a writer for their monthly magazine. Betty is also a volunteer here at the National Museum of Industrial History. She works as a docent in our museum, and she works in our archives, and she writes a column for our newsletters, and she helps us with press releases here. So we're really happy to have Betty. So please join me today in welcoming Peter and learning more about this legendary time that he had being an industrial photographer at Bethlehem Steel.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank everybody for coming today. I hope you enjoy this look back on some of our history. Back in 1974, when I was chief photographer at International Nickel, I met a man named Orland Donaldson. That was at a meeting of the Industrial Photographers of New York, where he laid out the whole realm of Bethlehem Steel photography. Certainly had no idea that I would ever work here. 2 years later, a blind ad pops up in the New York Times for a steel mill photographer in eastern Pennsylvania. And I started making phone calls to all my connections. And after about a day and a half, I learned that it was at Bethlehem Steel. So unfortunately, Orland wasn't still here. But what Orland did, he was buddies with Homer, Chairman Homer, namesake of Homer Labs on the mountain. And Orland crewed on Homer's yacht in the Bermuda race from Newport to Bermuda annually. And when Homer Labs was constructed, Orland managed to get this fantastic facility built. Now called Jordan Hall, about 14,000 square feet of studios and dark rooms. We had 26 people in the department when I was up there. We had a black and white department, a color department. The photographers did all their own black and white film processing. I think Orland set that up to keep us honest, because the key to photography back in the film age was a good negative. And the photographer was going to be in a hot seat immediately if he didn't turn in good negatives. So we each had our own darkroom. We had to process our own black and white film. The color film was a little more demanding, and he wouldn't trust that to photographers. So we had a professional color developing facility. In fact, it was so good that Kodak used to bring tours through as an example of the state-of-the-art facility in the middle 60s. This is some of the equipment. Some of you, I'm sure, recognize this. This was a standard camera that we all used for most of our photography. Good old Hasselblad. We all had Hasselblad systems, full complement of lenses. Another one, this is a view camera, which some of you probably know about. This is Linhof Technica. This enabled you to take pictures of architecture and straighten out the verticals and the horizontals, get everything lined up the way it should look. It also provided a huge negative for, super quality. Again, this is a lesser version of that 4x5 view camera. This was the standard press photographer's camera for about 50 years. That little thing laying flat on the side is one of the film holders. This is Linhof's Aero Technica, which Clarence Snyder used for his aerial photographs. We'll talk a little bit about that later when we get into some ship pictures. This was a special Graflux magazine. This actually held 6 sheets of 4x5 film. And you operated it by pulling that handle in and out. It rotated the films through. In order to take a decent aerial picture with a 4x5 camera, you had to stabilize it. So we had a gizmo called a gyro stabilizer. I still have that. Not this one, but the original one, if I could find it. I haven't used it since the digital age allowed us to jack up the ISO to really high levels, and you can shoot at a Nikon at a 10,000th of a second. So, and this was a standard Nikon F that we all had. This camera had interchangeable viewfinders, and some of the guys had the photomic finder, which clicked on the top, which enabled you to do automatic exposures with a Nikon. This was our strobe system. It looks a little strange, doesn't it? It doesn't look like a strobe system that most people have ever seen. But this was a famous Ascar Sunlight system. Those boxes on that little cart are the condensers. Each one of them weighed 35 or 40 pounds. I couldn't find a picture of the old flash head, but that flash head could take 50,000 watt seconds. So I ended up with this system for my own studio, and I sold it to a car studio in Detroit. Anyway, to get steel, you have to make iron, and to get iron, you have to blow up some rocks and grind it up into iron ore. So this was, I shot this out in Hibbing, Minnesota. These are 12-inch rock drills. They drill hundreds and hundreds of holes in the ore body and fill it up with ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel and blow it up. We had to go half a mile away to shoot this. So after the ore is broken up, they haul it off in rock trucks to a processing mill. These are ball mills in that Hibbing plant where the rocks go in and iron ore powder comes out. I don't have a picture of the separation tanks, but we did them. I don't know where the pictures are, but there's a process called flotation where the powder that comes out of these ball mills is mixed with some wetting agents and floated on water, scraped off, filtered, and turned into iron ore pellets. This is the aerial view of the facility. Did a lot of aerial views. Again, same plant, the pellets are in the foreground, and they would haul these to Bethlehem. So, also, of course, to make iron, you had to have coke from coal. This is a shot of the team putting in roof bolts in an underground mine. Interesting story here. I don't have pictures of it, but one of my introductions to coal mining at Bethlehem, I was sent out with another photographer named Len Ross. He was a terrific photographer. And we were in, I think, 48-inch coal, which meant that the ceiling was only this high. You had to go crawl around on your hands and knees to do anything. But we were there to photograph a longwall machine. Anybody in here know what it is? One hand, two hands. Okay. So it's a long machine with a track, and the cutter head goes along that track and grinds off a few inches of the coal. It goes onto a conveyor belt and it goes off to be collected. But the most interesting part is what happens behind the machine, because when the machine is ready to move, they drop the ceiling of the mine. So the mine roof is being held up with hydraulic jacks. And on cue, they let the jacks out and the roof comes down with a huge thud and a cloud of coal dust. So I didn't know about this. They were introducing me to the mine, and somebody taps me on the shoulder while we're taking pictures. He said, okay, you gotta move over here now. And as soon as I moved, he goes, what's going on? Boom, the roof came down. That's kind of exciting. Another one, this is an award one called Sentinels of Safety. I think Betty sent me down there to shoot this. You know, Betty, the co-author of my book, she was also a client, and that's the way photography worked at Bethlehem. The people in the PR department, the advertising department were our clients, and when there was an assignment would come through, you often had to go and meet with that client and go over the project. Sometimes they went out on the job with you, sometimes they didn't. This is a little coke getting ready to push. They've pulled the door off and they're getting ready to push it. It's the only coke picture I have left. You guys all know what this is. This was shot, I think, about 1980, 1981. And that's inside. There's the cast floor. For those of you who don't recognize this, the iron, they've drilled a hole through the clay plug in the base of the blast furnace, and the iron is running out in the foreground and going into a submarine car. And in the very background, the slag is running to the other side of the cast floor and going into slag pots. Very dangerous. I know of at least 2 people who died here on this cast floor. The slag pot had blew up. This is a man taking the temperature. They also, in the BOF furnace, the furnace has been tipped over. He's reading the temperature with a long probe. And they also would take a sample of that steel in that furnace. This is this used as the advertising for our lecture today, the teaming of the ingots. That's pretty much not done anymore. I think most steel is let out through a continuous caster. This is very old school. So here we have a row of ingots that have been recently stripped, and in the foreground is one that's being pulled out of what they call the soaking pit. I have an interesting story there. I had an assignment to photograph a defective soaking pit. No idea what they were talking about. But when I got down in that basement, it was about 140 degrees, and there was a crack in the overhead, and they were afraid that the molten steel was going to leak down into the basement. They wanted a picture of that crack. Well, typically, we worked for advertising and PR, but we also worked for the legal department. We worked for the plant managers. We worked for the research department. Just about any department in a company that needed a photograph, they called us. And rarely would they ever let an outside photographer into the plant. I think after the photo department was disbanded in the 80s, they would let outside guys come in to work on the annual report. But that's about it. So, a few rolling mill shots here. So that's an initial breakdown of an ingot. I think this was in the blooming mill. Beginning to take shape. This is in the combo mill. Cooling bed shot. When these beams come out, they let them cool for a while. They had a walking beam system that moved them along. If you got too close to it with the camera, you cracked the lens. I had broken several filters being too close. This is a hot saw. A hot saw meaning that the steel's being cut while it's still hot. And it's a larger section. I guess that's an H-beam been cut off by a hot saw. I don't know how that man did that job without a reflective suit on. Because I was 20 feet away and it was hot for me. The beam yard. So this is the current and the new generation of forming steel. It comes out of the furnace. It's called a continuous caster. This was Burns Harbor's caster. Unfortunately for photography, everything is moving in this picture. The steel's moving along, the flame cutter's moving along. If anybody has a question, raise your hand.
You mentioned that in the 80s, they wouldn't allow outside photographers back in. Were you then considered an outside photographer?
Well,
were you allowed access after the
Yes, but I was allowed in anyway.
Yeah.
Because my clients then would have been the same people that I worked for when I was an employee. There was some friction there. There was some politics going on. They tried to keep former employees out, but they weren't completely successful, so we got in. This is a plate mill in Burns Harbor, one of my big projects. You know, our department handled over 1,500 assignments a year. Some of them were 1-hour assignments, and some of them were a week or 2 weeks. This was a long one. This was a 2-week job. It's a 120-inch plate mill out of Burns Harbor. A lot of times when they send you to photograph a new mill, it isn't really functioning totally correctly, so you wait days sometimes to get a decent picture. Again, this is that same mill in Burns Harbor. I think this is the 60-inch mill in Burns Harbor. Anyway. So this gentleman, this is Jose Gonzalez, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly.
Santiago.
Santiago. Okay, you know him. And he was affectionately referred to as a screw man, which was probably an unflattering title, but that's where his job was. He rolled the steel. It was kind of like an organ control panel. He had a lot of foot pedals, keyboards, he had to watch all those monitors, and he guided the steel back and forth in the mill, and he controlled the position of the rolls with giant mechanical screws. That's how he got the name Screw Man, I guess. Now this is from the bar mill up in Lackawanna. They had a robotic system there to capture the bars when they came out of the mill. They actually had two systems. They could come out straight also, but then they had to be cut off. And that is a mill cobble. Bethlehem would never show this picture to anybody, except maybe internally. They might get to look at this. We didn't show cobble pictures to people outside. Very dangerous. Steel was moving through that mill by that point at maybe 50 miles an hour. And if one of the guides wasn't set properly, it would get loose. It's called a cobble. And it would knock out hydraulic lines, it would knock out electrical lines, and it would kill you if you were anywhere near it. Interesting thing I had to do, I made this, scanned an old color negative from the collection when we were getting ready to do the book. And the color of the color negative film had degraded so much that I had to convert my picture to black and white and then put the color back in the cobble in Photoshop. I did that on several photos. And Betty was with me on this assignment. Remember Wally's last name, Betty?
No, I don't.
Anyway, but this is one of the ways our photography was used. This is a typical ad for the company. So we'd go up there with lighting equipment, strobe equipment, light up the coils, light up Wally. Another typical use picture. This is down in Florida when they were rebuilding the bridges in the Florida Keys.
Peter, an interesting note on this photo and some of the others. Not only was the photography used for promotional purposes and advertising purposes, there was also stories that were written within my group that we gave to technical magazines. The whole theme being built with steel, specifically Bethlehem steel.
So more or less an advertorial where
kind of like an advertorial.
Where you would supply the copy with our pictures. We would supply the copy,
and we would also interview project principals such as the construction manager, the owner of the project, with the underlying theme of why did you decide to build in steel versus concrete or composite construction, as well as why did you choose Bethlehem versus U.S. Steel or somebody else.
Sure.
So it wasn't a hard sell, it was more of a soft sell through publicity.
Yeah, I think the advertising department, which PR was part of, we had over 100 employees.
It was public affairs, and at one point, before everything started scaling back in the late 70s, early 80s, we had about 120.
About 120 employees.
And that included photography, advertising, news media, community affairs, state government affairs, and federal government affairs.
This wire rope from Williamsport, the Williamsport plant, that's like a cable for a drag line. It's like 5 inches in diameter. You just can't imagine how big this is. All right, so Steelton, they made pipe. They made lots of pipe. This is a picture out of the archives, which Andrea dug out for me. And there's a shot of, they told me, I think 200 miles of Alaskan oil pipeline before it shipped out. Shot this from a crane. Did a lot of these pseudo aerials from cranes. Helicopters at low level just didn't work well. Kicked up a lot of dust and dirt and so forth. So we hired a crane. This was a helicopter shot, however. I chased this pipe for miles and miles and miles. So another division which almost nobody knows about, down near Sparrows Point, we had a division called Buffalo Tank, where they made tanks for service stations, for whole petroleum industry, all kinds of tanks. Yeah, this is the Cole Porter, made in Johnstown. And that train was being delivered to a power plant. It wasn't this plant. I don't know where the plant was, but it made a great backdrop. Again, a helicopter, chasing it with a helicopter. Another shot along the Susquehanna. So, insiders know that Bethlehem Steel made a lot of ships. Like 1,100 ships for World War II in shipbuilding plants on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the West Coast, all over the place. And our photographers went out to photograph them. So while I was here at Bethlehem Steel, Clarence Snyder was the premier aerial photographer, especially of ships. He would go out in a helicopter, doors off, marine radio in his hand, talking to the captain of the ship the whole time, telling him which way to turn into the waves or into the sun or wherever to get the proper angle. Winter or summer, didn't matter what time of the year it was a really arduous job. There he is. Again, Andrea found this as a clip from one of their movies. Clarence with that Aero Technica. So we'll go through a few of his ship pictures here. I don't know if any of you have ever done aerial photography, but it's a hostile environment. That's the best way to describe it. It's extremely noisy, it's extremely cold, it's extremely windy. I had an assignment once that in northern Canada, in order to change film, I had to land a helicopter, go into a building to change film in the camera, then go back and get in the helicopter.
You don't have to duck bullets, so.
So you can imagine, Clarence do this shot, he was flying at the level of the mast on the ship, and the helicopter's crabbing sideways. It's going sideways with the ship, and he's shooting out the door towards the ship. Pretty crazy. And you can see it's a very windy day, very hard to hold the helicopter steady. I don't think Clarence shot this. This was 1963, I think this picture was made. He might have. Destroyer. Another one of Clarence's pet projects was the jack-up oil rigs that were built down in Beaumont, Texas. And again, you have to take the door off the helicopter, fly 100 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico to do this. So this is one of my projects with an oil rig, where the hand and the wrench was done in the studio, and the background was picked up from another photo shoot that we did out in the Gulf of Mexico. There it is. We had to hire an oil service boat, a model. So the model, the art director, and myself went out on this boat. I think it was only about 30 miles out. Take the pictures.
Peter, did you have an art director with you on most of your shoots?
No, only on a few of them. I think Osiander went on this.
And what would the role of the art director be in this photo?
Well, the art director, in order to go out and do this, would have had some concept in his head of the ad that he was going to do. He may have had it roughed out already, a rough drawing already, and then he would helped me guide the model and what to do, how to stand, where to look, all that sort of stuff. So this was done out of La Paz, Texas, which was near the Beaumont Yard. Did a number of shots. And that's one of the ads. So that earlier shot with the wrench was one of the outtakes from that boat trip. People recognize that building. So this was shot in the Hoboken Yard. They were cleaning the hull of a ship. I can't imagine, on that bloody ladder was like 25 feet tall, and he's got a sandblasting gun. It could have knocked the ladder right over. All right, Iron Foundry. These are in the book. Most of these pictures are in our book.
And that was taken right here in the, basically across the street.
Yep, exactly, across the street. Is anything left inside that building? Completely cleaned out?
It could be storage. I don't know if anybody.
Yeah. But at this point, did we do this in one of the plant brochures, I think? I took supplemental lighting along. The habit of still photographers, they did not take a lot of supplemental lighting along. Occasionally, a little handheld flash. In a mine, we had to take, but the mine supervisors did not like us setting off flash bulbs or anything like that in a coal mine for fear that the place would blow up. So over the years, when I did it in other mines, I would take like underwater photography strobes that were guaranteed to not get any coal mine gas into them, so that it was safe to use them. But these are regular studio strobes that I lug down there. All right, a use of a casting. I guess the saddle for this bridge was made up of many castings, all welded together, bolted together. In order to get this picture, Lenny had to go up in the crane to take the picture. He couldn't do it from a helicopter. It was too dangerous to get the helicopter near this. You couldn't time it. It had to be timed precisely for wind and tide. Very delicate operation, so helicopters were out. So to get the picture, Lenny climbed hand over hand up inside the framework of the crane. Amazing. This is one of mine. This is a bank building in Lower Manhattan. It was about 10 below zero when we did this. Didn't bother the Indians, the Mohawk Indians at all. Some more architectural work. Before Photoshop, in order to do decent architectural work, you had to use one of those big view cameras. In our case, there were 4x5s. I've worked with 8x10 over the years to correct the perspective, because you had to turn in the picture with the perspective already corrected. There was no photoshopping. I shot this from the roof of a neighboring building. There was a little magic to a business card which said Bethlehem Steel on it. Because to take this picture, I had to get on the roof of another building. Building managers did not like people being on the roofs of their building. They had a fear of jumpers, they had all kinds of insurance issues with it, but a Bethlehem Steel business card got Barney and I onto the roof of this building and shot this with a Nikon 40mm, which didn't have any, Nikon 40mm was rectilinear corrected so the building wasn't all curved and warped out of shape. This, I think, was the last building that FSC built in Manhattan. Remember, Betty?
No, no.
Down in Dallas. This is the assignment was this tower and the building behind it called the Reunion Arena. But Osiander and I, Glenn Osiander, the art director, we were staying in this hotel, this Hyatt hotel. It was so fantastic that we decided to get up early in the morning and shoot it at sunrise.
I wrote a feature that ended up being published in a couple of engineering magazines of the Reunion Arena, which is where, I don't know, I'm not a vast NBA fan, which is where the Dallas Mavericks played.
Yeah.
And there was a truss system up on the roof. And I was walking on a catwalk up there above what was center court below.
Okay. Speaking of catwalks, that's how we got this picture, that I got this picture of the Thomas Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. There was a catwalk system up right under the glass roof, and they let me up there. Again, magic of the Bethlehem Steel business card. Take this picture, and AIA Journal, which Bethlehem bought a lot of ad space in, picked it up, some of my pictures up, and used it in their own ad. So again, more architectural work. This was shot with 4x5. Not exactly fun in August with the sun beating down and you have a black cloth over your head trying to look in the back of the view camera. Anyway, this is the first digital work that I did for Bethlehem. This is the coal mill down at Sparrows Point. In 2003, I think we did this. And this was a 6 megapixel digital camera. It wasn't actually a camera, it was a digital back that went on the rear of a Hasselblad. 1999, I bought that system. Never looked back at film. One of the really, really beautiful things about shooting with a tethered digital camera is I would have a laptop like this with me, and my pictures would show up on this laptop, and everything could be made perfect. You'd get the focus perfect, the exposure perfect, the composition perfect, and the art director's leaning over your shoulder and telling you to move the camera. But you knew that you had it perfect before you left, which is really good. Made a big difference. All right, crazy story. So one of the assignments that we had that bounced back on us, and every once in a while an assignment would bounce back. That means our client down in advertising or PR didn't like the photos, sent them back to our boss and said, you gotta do something different. So what we were doing, we were photographing Galvalume roofs already constructed on buildings. And they were kind of boring. There was always something wrong. There was tar spread around. They just didn't look attractive. So the art director on this was Glenn Osiander again. He said, you guys got to come up with something. So I got a calendar with a bunch of landscape photos, tore them out, cut out some pictures of Galvalume, stuck them on the calendars, sent it down to him. He said, let's go. So I fabricated a metal frame, an aluminum frame with magnets on it, and a giant case that we could ship these things in, so we could get the 2 panels, the disassembled frame, everything in something we could give to the airline for baggage, and took off and went all over the country. Now, underneath it, you can't see the frame, and it's sitting on a tripod wedged in between the rocks in Joshua Trees National Monument. Another shot in Joshua Trees. I don't know why the Park Service let us do this, but they did. Again, the idea was to shoot this with chickens, but chickens run away. Turkeys gather around. I guess they thought we had food or something. So this was shot out on one of Jandal's farms. Another crazy one. So I guess it was 81, we did this, 82 maybe. I had a friend in Jackson Hole who was a backcountry ski guide. And he hooked me up with a backcountry helicopter. We loaded all our stuff in the helicopter and went up on top of a mountain to shoot this. We were lucky, the weather was nice. Now here's some of the ads that the Galvin pictures went into. This was shot on the desert in Southern California, out near Yuma, Arizona. Again, products. This is Lebanon had a drop forge where these fasteners were all created on the drop forge. Extra strong. I think some of this one was part of a railroad car construction. This is a mine roof bolt. This is the mine roof bolts coming out of the drop forge machine. Steelton. You know, we photographed a lot of big forgings for Beth Forge Division. The ingots for those forgings were made in Steelton because they had electric furnaces out there and they could cast these giant ingots.
There's a giant ingot, I still think it's there, that's been there for about 25 years, right by, right near the casino.
Yeah.
And it's still on a railroad flat, and it's just sitting there. It's been sitting there since like 1996 and 97.
Nobody put it there intentionally, it's just been left.
Yeah.
Too big to scrap. Question?
That's exactly why, Peter. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Nobody knows what to do with it. And the steel quality.
You can't put it back in the furnace. To cut it up would take forever. Question?
That did come from Steelton. We brought it here on our railroad, and we were told to set it there just for eye candy, if you will.
Okay. Conversation piece. Great conversation piece. I know eventually there was a huge amount of energy and heat loss to take this hot ingot out of the mold and ship it to Bethlehem. By the time it was ready to go back in the furnace, it was cold. So I think they designed some railroad cars which were insulated to try to get the ingots here quickly.
They had hoods, insulated hoods over the ingots, and they had gas burners.
They had burners in the car.
Keep the steel above 1,000
Yeah, yeah.
or cracks. So when were these pictures taken?
Wow.
In the 80s, they were still casting these ingots here at the electric furnaces in Bethlehem.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at the files to know exactly when this was taken. But I continued to work for Lehigh Heavy Forge after they bought it from Bethlehem or
Yeah, the electric
International
furnace-
Steel Group, whatever.
The electric furnace here shut down in 1995, shortly after the BOF. And they put in expanded expanded capacity at Steelton, specifically for the big ingots to be created for Beth Forge. And those ingots were up to 320 tons,
Yeah.
How far away is Steelton?
90 miles.
So here we are, reheat furnace down at Beth Forge. It's just, you could be here in January. The temperature in this facility might be 20 degrees, 25 degrees. And they open the door to this furnace and roll out this railroad car, and you'd feel your skin about to blister. It's just, the radiant energy that comes off of this hot steel is incredible. And a piece as big as these ingots are is just unimaginable. One of my early assignments for Bethlehem was some of the clients wanted documentation of every phase of a project. And I think this was for a generator shaft for General Electric or Westinghouse, I'm not sure which, that I had to go down there every couple of days and take pictures. So this is the initial breakdown of this ingot. You can see that it's now getting a squared off shape. Now this is a shot of him removing the sink head. That's a part of, from the ingot mold that was to allow for contraction of the steel when it was cooling. And if you ever made a candle at home, or your wife made homemade candles, and you pour the wax in the mold, and after it's cooled, it's all sunken in on the top. Same thing happened with steel. So they would use this as a handle under the forge in order to manipulate the forging, but eventually it had to be cut off. Can you imagine being the guy doing that? He's got a 20-foot steel pipe with pure oxygen coming out of the end, and he's burning his way through that thing. Here again, they've punched a hole in that ingot to make a cylinder. This is, this man is flame scarfing. Some of you probably know what that is. But when you start to move the steel around and change the shape, it could crack. And that would ruin the whole thing. If you let that crack propagate, it would destroy the whole forging. So they would go and repair that while the forging was going on. I saw them do that to plates out in Burns Harbor too. They had a bunch of plates laid out on the ground, and they had a man going along with a torch repairing cracks in these big plates that were going to go back in the mill to be rolled out thinner. This is air quenching. So in the background, you'll see these are mill rolls, by the way, and that's a car that's just come out of the preheat furnace. There was 3 rolls on it. They've moved one up onto this roller contraption, and they have giant fans blowing on it to time accurately how fast it cools. The time used to cool steel is part of the prescription for hardening. They have prescriptions, temperature change and time. There's one being water quenched. All right, this is down Machine Shop 8. This is an almost finished rotor shaft. I was told I think that's Machine Shop 2. And that's a nuclear vessel forging being machined into whatever they're going to do with it. Sometimes they machined them like this, and then they cut them apart and they welded them back together again. This is from Forge Specialty, where they had, these are mill rolls going to some other steel mill, or could be an aluminum mill or whatever, titanium. To do this is not available lighting. I have a whole lot of strobes in here, big sheets of white paper hung up. And here's a chronology of one of the big forgings. And one of the fun projects I had for Beth Forge Division was a calendar series that they published for quite a few years. This shows you how all those forging pictures got used. Lehigh Heavy Forge is still using the pictures that I made back for Bethlehem Steel, plus a few that I made for them directly. Now, a little history. Anybody know what that is?
Like an infrared shot.
That is, it is an infrared black and white photograph, but that is one of the 16-inch guns from the battleship Missouri. At the end of World War II, the Japanese surrender was signed under that gun. It has now become part of a museum at Cape Henlopen State Park in Delaware. You have a question?
No, we've been there.
Yeah, a bunch of really dedicated archaeologists managed to track that gun down before it was scrapped, and it ended up at our museum in Lewis. From my understanding was that they had to change these gun barrels on a routine basis. They were only good for about 100 shots, and then they had to change the barrels out. And most of them were made right here in Bethlehem.
Why, what would deteriorate on
Question?
She asked what would deteriorate on the gun.
the barrel?
That was a 16-incher.
No, but why would they have to change it out? What happened?
Where? They get worn.
Rifling.
And I guess some of them they could remachine, but there comes a point where you have to have a new one. Anyway, that's the end of my little talk here. Well, anybody, any other questions?
Do you have a favorite shot that you took?
Yeah, I do actually. The man cutting off the sink head in the forging department with that shower of sparks. Because that picture was actually defined by the light of the sparks. Kind of unusual. I have a lot of favorites, but that particular one, yes. Yeah, when in 1982, in late '82, they came through. The manager, the advertising division, came up on the hill and he laid off half of the photography department. 6 months later, they laid off the other half of the photography department. So we all had to go off in our own directions. I mean, I had a family, kids, house, cars, and now I had no insurance and no income. So I started freelancing, and I did manage to do some work for Bethlehem Steel. I mean, there were some political issues, but I still did shoot for Bethlehem for a while, on and off. I shot for Lehigh Heavy Forge, because they liked the pictures I did for that calendar series so much, and their advertising PR man, Alan Robinson, was a former Bethlehem employee, so he hired me to work for Lehigh Heavy Forge. But then I had to freelance just for whatever companies I could. So a lot of the work was done for Lieberman Appaloochee Agency out of Allentown, who had Bethlehem Steel contracts. There was a couple of other small design shops, graphic design shops that I worked for. So I was an employee for about 6 years, 77 to 82.
Yeah, I was having a hard time following yours.
Yeah.
And I took pictures for this company and that company. It's not all steel. It's
Yeah.
not all Bethlehem.
Yeah, I mean, in order to get the job here at Bethlehem Steel, I had to demonstrate some industrial ability. But I was, at the time, I was a chief photographer for International Nickel, and it was the same thing, mining, metal alloy, Inco had an alloying facility in Huntington, West Virginia. It's now called, I think it's called Huntington Alloys today, where they had a melt shop and they made nickel alloys and they rolled plates and sheets and rods and you name it out there in Huntington. They did contract rolling for the titanium business in Huntington.
What happened to all of the photographs? Were they
Ah.
on the archives?
What happened to all the photographs? That's a $64,000 question. A number of things happened to the old photographs. So we had thousands and thousands of photographs. There was a point when the company was in trouble in the 90s when there was a person had a brainstorm that he could cut costs if he could get rid of a person in charge of keeping the files. But they had to get rid of the files. So they sent a lot of the files out to the divisions where the pictures were made. So they sent Sparrows Point pictures down to Baltimore. They sent Burns Harbor pictures out to Indiana, and so on and so forth. And then when they did finally shut down, Lance Metz from the Canal Museum came running in and said, "Oh my gosh, we have to save these pictures." So Lance saved a lot of the glass plates and I don't know how many others he managed to save. So we had given away to divisions around the country. We had trash cans filled. We had the Canal Museum grab a bunch of pictures, and then this museum has saved, I guess, the bulk of what was left. So somebody stuck them in a warehouse and saved them, thankfully.
I have a comment on your cameras. the
Sure.
Hasselblad.
Sure.
When I was a young man, I always wanted one. That was back in the 1960s. They were selling for almost $800.
Yep.
Well, I got in the service in the military, got to Hong Kong, and I bought one for $200. Brand new. That's the money they made by importing them.
It's possible, sure.
Yeah.
I had, each photographer had one or two Hasselblads here at Steele. When they laid us off in '82, they let me borrow my assigned equipment for a few months. And then they offered me a deal where I could buy it. So I physically bought and paid for all the Hasselblads that I was using at Bethlehem Steel. I used my own 4x5 equipment because it was better than what Steel was letting us use. And it was always a fight to get it. There was a very limited amount of the 4x5 equipment, and other photographers may have wanted to use it. I was one of 6 full-time photographers, and our boss, our manager, was a skilled photographer, so he was out doing assignments sometimes also. So that's the way it went. And when I switched to digital, I was, in 1999, I was using a Hasselblad from the 1960s. You know, we didn't buy a new camera every other year back then in the days of film. So a Hasselblad would last 30, 40, 50 years. We had a working relationship with a gentleman in New York named Marty Forscher, professional camera repair. He was the world's best camera repair guy. And you know, you'd come back from an assignment and they said, "Peter, how'd your shoot go?" And it was either good or you had a Dear Marty issue, you know, which meant that your camera broke. You had to call Marty Forscher and get it fixed. I had an assignment I was shooting a bridge in Texas, a railroad bridge, and I had to catch it with a train coming under it. And while I was setting up my camera, it jammed. So there I am in Texas, no cell phones, 25 miles from civilization. The train was coming. What the hell am I going to do? So I got to a phone, called Marty, and he says, "Get a small screwdriver, and I'm going to tell you how to fix this." And he did. I was able to get the camera unjammed, put a different lens on it, and go do the shoot. Yeah. The Hasselblads were good cameras, and I don't know if I would have trusted one bought in Hong Kong. I just.
That's why they were so expensive. They were so good cameras.
Yeah, they were good cameras, but they were repairable. And my camera jammed, and I was able to get it unjammed by taking the film magazine off the back, I could reach inside the camera with a screwdriver, wind the shutter mechanism up manually, and disengage the lens. So then I switched to a different body and a different lens and got my pictures.
You got the train picture too?
Yeah, sure. Anybody questions? Well, we have our books. Betty and I have our books available in the back. There's a couple sample there's a sample copy, at least one you can look through, and if you'd like to purchase one, we'd be happy to sign it. Thank you all for coming.